Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was the last survivor of a collapsing multiverse? Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The first thing Izuku Midoriya registered was the absence of everything. It was not darkness. Darkness was a presence, a heavy blanket that swallowed light. This was its opposite, a uniform, featureless, an infinite whiteness that stretched in every direction with no horizon, no floor, no ceiling. It was a blank page the size of forever. The second thing he registered was the silence. Not the quiet of a library or the hush of a snowy night. This was an absolute, profound muteness that felt heavy, like a physical pressure against his eardrums. The only sound was a high-pitched, ethereal ringing, the last dying nerve scream of an auditory system with nothing to hear. It was the sound of sound's own death. He was floating. Or maybe falling. Or maybe perfectly still. Without a point of reference, the concepts were meaningless. His body, clad in the tattered remains of his gamma suit, was a lonely island of color and form in the stark void. The green fabric was shredded, the dark turquoise armor plating cracked and scored. One of his iron-soled boots was missing entirely, his socked foot feeling a cold that wasn't truly cold, just another profound absence, the absence of warmth. His body ached. It was a deep, resonant throb that seemed to live in his bones, a phantom memory of being broken and put back together 100 times. Yet when he tried to clench a fist, to push against the pain, there was no resistance. His limbs moved through the nothingness as if through a vacuum. He tried to take a breath and his lungs filled, a reflexive, panicked action. But what was he breathing? There was no air, no scent of ozone or dust, just a substanceless medium that sustained him against all logic. Hello? The word formed in his throat but died on his lips, swallowed by the oppressive silence before it could become a vibration. No echo. No sound. Just the thought of a word, a ghost of a voice. Where am I? The thought was clearer, a frantic scramble in his mind. Is this a quirk? Some new villain? Shigaraki? All for one? He tried to activate one for all, to feel the familiar lightning crackle across his skin. A strange, sluggish warmth answered him, a deep well of power that felt different. Heavier. It pooled in his core, a leaden weight of potential, but it didn't erupt. It was contained, muted. Danger sense, his ever-present alarm bell for threats, was utterly silent. For the first time since he'd manifested it, the quirk of the fourth user had nothing to report. There was no danger here. There was nothing to be in danger. His mind, a hero's mind trained to analyze and overcome, desperately searched for data. He catalogued his injuries, scrapes, bruises, the deep ache that suggested multiple fractures that were no longer there. He catalogued his surroundings, white, silent, infinite. He catalogued his state, alive, breathing, alone. The equation refused to solve. The variables were impossible. Then, a flicker. In the seamless white, a sliver of darkness tore open for a nanosecond, and through it he saw a star. Just one. It was beautiful and terrifyingly distant, and then it was gone. But the image was enough. It was a key turning a rusted lock in the depths of his memory. The dam of shock that was holding back the horror didn't just break, it detonated. The void around him dissolved, replaced by the deafening roar of a collapsing city. He was in the air, propelled by F.A. Jean and Black Whip, the sky above Mizutafu a nightmare tapestry of cracking light. The ground was trembling, not from an earthquake, but from reality itself coming undone. Buildings were dissolving into shimmering, golden dust, the particles drifting upwards into the fissures in the sky. He was reaching for her. Uraraka. Her helmet was gone, her brown hair whipping in a wind that didn't obey physics. She was suspended a dozen feet from him, her own quirk malfunctioning, gravity twisting and warping around her. She was reaching back, her gloved fingertips straining to meet his. Deku! Her voice was distorted, stretched thin like taffy, but he heard it. He saw the terror in her wide, beautiful eyes, a terror that was rapidly being replaced by a heartbreaking, profound sadness. He poured more of one for all into his flight, his arms screaming in protest as he stretched, his fingers just a hair's breadth from hers. Uraraka! He roared, his voice ripped away by the howling gale of uncreation. Her form began to shimmer, just like the buildings. The edges of her pink and black hero suit blurred, turning translucent. Her fingertips, so close to his, became motes of golden light. "It's okay," he read her lips more than heard them. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it, too, dissolved into light before it could fall. Her expression softened into one of acceptance, one of love. Her mouth formed his name one last time, Izuku, but the word was made of dust and light, scattered into the nothingness that was consuming her. His fingers closed on empty air. Her form completely disintegrated, a brief, brilliant constellation of a girl who loved heroes, before winking out of existence entirely. He was left reaching for a ghost, a scream of pure agony trapped in his lungs. The memory ended, and he was back in the white void, curled into a tight ball. A sob racked his body, a dry, silent heave of his shoulders. No, that wasn't right. It was a nightmare. It had to be, but the key had been turned. The floodgates were open. The flickers came faster now, a strobe light of trauma, each flash a new scene from the final, horrifying moments. The ground shook violently. He saw Bakugo, his rival, his friend. Katsuki Bakugo was a whirlwind of explosive fury, his gauntlets already fired past their limit. He wasn't aiming at a villain, he was aiming at the sky. The encroaching white void was pouring down, a waterfall of oblivion. It didn't destroy what it touched, it erased it. Damn it all! Bakugo roared, his voice raw and filled with a magnificent, futile defiance. He unleashed an AP shot, a concentrated beam of explosive power, straight into the heart of the approaching wave of nothingness. For a moment it seemed to work. The explosion was immense, a sunbright flash of orange and white that pushed back against the void. It was Bakugo's entire being focused into a single, defiant act, a final, desperate middle finger to the end of the world. But the void was patient. It was inevitable. It didn't break or shatter. It simply consumed the explosion. The light, the heat, the concussive force, all of it was snuffed out, absorbed into the silent white like a candle flame in a hurricane. The sound of the blast was eaten before it could even reach Deku's ears. Bakugo's eyes widened, not in fear, but in disbelief, in pure, undiluted rage that his ultimate power was less than nothing. The white wave touched the tips of his spiky blonde hair. Deku. You bastard. You better. The rest was lost. His form, his anger, his entire explosive existence, was unwritten from the page of reality. One moment he was there, a burning star of defiance. The next, there was only the silent, indifferent white. Kaken, Izuku whispered, the name a shard of glass in his throat. He clawed at his own chest, the pain there more real than the ache in his bones. This couldn't be real. He was Izuku Midoriya. He saved people. He didn't watch them die. Another flicker. This one was different. It wasn't in the outside world. It was inside him. He was in the mindscape. The familiar, somber room with the chairs. But it was shaking, crumbling. The stone floor was cracking, and through the cracks, the same terrifying white light was pouring in. The spectral forms of the previous one for all users were flickering like faulty holograms. And there, standing before his own empty chair, was the glowing, ethereal form of Toshinori Yagi. All Might. He looked not at Deku, but through him, a sad, proud smile on his skeletal face. He wasn't a true vestige, just a powerful imprint, a psychic echo left behind by the sheer force of his will. And that echo was fading fast. The embers of One for All that had once resided in him were now fully integrated into Izuku's core, but his spirit, his consciousness, remained. And it was saying goodbye. You did good, my boy. The voice was not a sound, but a feeling, a thought projected directly into Izuku's soul. It was warm and full of pride. You became a true hero. Greater than I ever was. Izuku, or his psychic projection in the mindscape, reached for him. All Might. Don't go. I still need you. All Might's smile widened, but his form was becoming transparent, the light within him dimming. You never needed me, young Midoriya. You just needed someone to show you the hero that was already there. He raised a translucent hand, pointing forward. Now, go beyond. A tear, made of pure light and memory, rolled down the hero's spectral cheek. Plus. Ultra. And with a final, gentle pulse of golden light, the form of All Might, the symbol of peace, the man who had given him everything, dissolved completely. His chair, the eighth chair, crumbled into dust. The void outside the mindscape roared, and the vision shattered. Izuku screamed. He screamed until his throat was raw, but the sound was stillborn, devoured by the crushing silence. He screamed for Ochako, for Kaken, for All Might. He screamed for his mother, whose face he saw for a horrifying instant, looking up at the cracking sky from her apartment window, her expression one of confusion before she, too, was erased. He screamed for Ida, for Todoroki, for Kirishima, for Yayorozu, for every single one of his friends, his teachers, his fellow heroes. The flashes now came in a torrent, a chaotic montage of the apocalypse. Mirio, his costume in tatters, holding a terrified Eri in his arms. Her horn was glowing with an uncontrollable, blinding intensity. She was trying to rewind it. Trying to rewind the end of the universe. The power, raw and untamed, was too much. It wasn't healing or restoring. It was lashing out, distorting the space around them. Mirio gritted his teeth, his body phasing uncontrollably as he tried to shield her from the backlash of her own quirk fighting a cosmic force. It's too much, he yelled. Eri, stop! But she was just a child, crying, pouring all her desperate hope and love into her power. The wave of nothingness washed over them. For a heart-stopping second, Eri's horn flared, holding it back by a single inch, a tiny bubble of reality in a sea of non-existence. Then, it was overwhelmed. The horn, the child, the selfless hero holding her, gone, the sky itself. He remembered looking up from the chaos of the final battle, a battle against a foe that was not a person but a principle. The blue expanse of the heavens fractured like a pane of glass struck by a hammer. Shards of reality, reflecting distorted images of the world below, peeled away and fell into the abyss. Behind the cracks was the source of it all, the sterile, horrifying whiteness. The world was not being destroyed. It was being deleted. When the last memory faded, Izuku was left limp and trembling in the void. The shock was gone, replaced by a grief so vast and so absolute that it had a physical weight. It pressed down on him, threatening to crush the very atoms of his being. He was the last one. The sole survivor of everything and everyone he had ever known and loved. The thought was a dagger of ice in his heart. Why? Why me? The question echoed in the silent chambers of his soul. Why was he spared? What cruel joke left him, the boy who would break his own bones to save one person, to be the only person left in existence? It wasn't a joke. The thought was not his own. It was a whisper, faint and layered, like many voices speaking at once from a great distance. It was a necessity. Slowly, hesitantly, Izuku turned his focus inward again. He sank into his own consciousness, past the grief and the horror, seeking the familiar warmth of one for all. He found his way back to the mindscape. It was a ruin. The grand chamber of the vestiges was no longer a stable room. It was a small, spherical bubble of reality, floating precariously in the oppressive white void he now recognized as the space outside. The stone floor was shattered into floating islands of debris. The chairs, except for All Might's, which was now just a pile of dust, were cracked and faded, their occupants barely there. He saw their forms, but they were no longer the solid, distinct spirits he had once spoken to. They were echoes, heat signatures of souls that had burned themselves out. They flickered and drifted like smoke in a breeze. He saw Yoichi Shigaraki, the first, a core of faint, steady light at the very center of the bubble. He was the anchor, the origin point. His presence felt like stability, a quiet, stubborn refusal to cease. He saw the second and third users, their forms barely more than sharp-angled silhouettes. Their presence was a feeling of cold, hard pragmatism, a sense of analysis and grim purpose. He saw Haiku Shinomori, the fourth, a frantic, vibrating wisp of energy. Danger Sense wasn't a voice. It was his entire spectral being, a silent, continuous scream directed at the void pressing in on their sanctuary. He saw Daigoro Banjo, the fifth, as faint, struggling tendrils of black energy. Black Whip was actively trying to hold their crumbling mindscape together, stitching the fractured pieces of their reality with fading threads of power. He saw N, the sixth, as a swirling cloud of gray mist, trying to obscure their bubble, to hide it from whatever lay outside. It was smokescreen, not as a tool for stealth, but as a desperate, instinctual act of concealment. And then he saw her. Nana Shimura. Her form was the most distinct, though still translucent and flickering. He could make out the shape of her hero costume, the curve of her sad smile. She drifted towards him, her hand outstretched. Her presence was a wave of warmth, of heartbreaking maternal sorrow, and a powerful, undeniable push of encouragement. Izuku reached for her, his own spiritual form mimicking his physical one. Nana, what happened? Where is everyone? Her voice was a chorus of whispers, the combined, fading intent of all the vestiges speaking through her, the one with the strongest connection to him. Gone, ninth. All of it. Our world, our universe, it was unraveled. Unraveled? Izuku's mind latched onto the word. By what? All for one? The feeling that came from the second and third was a sharp, cold negative. Not a person. A force. An ending. It came for everything. And it succeeded. Izuku's heart, even in this spiritual form, felt like it was cracking. Then, why am I here? Why did I survive? This time, the warmth from Nana intensified, and the light from Yoichi pulsed in time with her words. One for all. The tendrils of Banjo's black whip drifted from the walls of the bubble and brushed against him, showing him. The pragmatic thoughts of the second and third user laid out the impossible physics. The silent scream of the fourth user gave it context. One for all was a quirk that stockpiled power. For 9 generations, it had stockpiled not just raw physical energy, but the will, the spirit, the very life force of its wielders. It was a reservoir of heroic intent. In the final moments, as the fundamental laws of their reality were being dissolved by the great unraveling, the collective will of the 8 vestiges, combined with the explosive potential of the stockpiled power, performed its final, ultimate act of heroism. It saved its wielder. We could not save our world, Nana's echo whispered, her translucent fingers now centimeters from his cheek. The force was too absolute. But we could save you. We focused everything, all our power, all our memories, all our souls, into a single purpose, to protect the 9th. The bubble of reality they were in, the mindscape, was not just in his head anymore. It was him. They had forged one for all into a reality anchor, a lifeboat dimension. It created a tiny, self-contained pocket of their dead reality with Izuku Midoriya at its absolute center. It was a paradox, an indigestible fragment of existence that the void could not erase, shielded by the combined sacrifice of 8 generations of heroes. So you saved me, Izuku said, the scale of their sacrifice washing over him. He looked at their fading forms, at the empty 8th chair. All Might's final act was to pour his spiritual remnant into this shield. They had all died a second time to save him. The grief was suffocating. You shouldn't have, he choked out. You should have let me go with everyone else, and let the legacy of one for all end in nothing? The second's cold logic cut through his sorrow. Unacceptable. To live is to hope, Nana's presence insisted, her warmth a stark contrast to the second's chill. As long as you draw breath, 9th, they are not truly gone. You carry them now. Not just us. All of them. Izuku looked down at his own hands in the mindscape. He could feel it now. The leaden weight in his core wasn't just power. It was everything. It was the ghost of every quirk that had ever existed. It was the faint, echoing energy of the 8 billion souls of his Earth. It was the light of dead stars, the memory of forgotten nebulae, the fundamental laws of a universe that was no more. One for all was no longer just a quirk. It was an ark. An infinitely dense, impossibly heavy tomb carrying the seed of a dead cosmos. He was the last survivor, carrying the ashes of his entire reality within his own soul. The burden was so immense, so absolute, that he felt his spiritual form begin to buckle. Then, a flicker, not a memory this time. The bubble of their mindscape shuddered violently. The white void outside seemed to press in, its blankness taking on a hungry, predatory quality. Heike Shinomori's form vibrated with an intensity that threatened to tear it apart. It knows, his silent scream conveyed. The anchor is weakening. The sacrifice was not infinite, Banjo's tendrils conveyed, the black thread starting to fray and dissolve. The energy is finite. We are fading. The floor beneath Izuku's feet cracked further. The white light from the void outside bled through, erasing the stone. Nana Shimura's form flared brightly, her expression turning from one of sad comfort to urgent panic. She didn't try to touch him this time. She shoved him. It was a spiritual push, a desperate, final command. Go! Live, Izuku! Her voice, for one moment, was perfectly clear, no longer a layered whisper. It was the voice of a mother, a mentor, a hero, pouring the last of her essence into a single command. You must live! The mindscape shattered. Izuku's consciousness was violently ejected back into his physical body. The serene, sterile whiteness of his lifeboat dimension was no longer stable. It was flickering violently, like a dying fluorescent bulb. Cracks, like the ones he'd seen in the sky of his world, were appearing in the fabric of his sanctuary. Through them, he saw not a different color, but a deeper nothingness. A true void, cold, absolute, and utterly devoid of any law or substance. The high-pitched ringing in his ears changed, deepening into a groaning, tearing sound. The reality anchor was failing. The lifeboat was breaking apart. The echoes of the vestiges gave him one last, unified warning, a chorus of fading light and desperate will projected into his mind. Cannot hold. It's failing. Brace yourself. Ninth. The white bubble that had been his prison and his salvation shattered into a million points of light, like a mirror dropped onto concrete. The true void rushed in. He felt a force, unimaginable and absolute, seize him. It was not a pull or a push, but a violent dislocation, a sense of being turned inside out and outside in simultaneously. The silence was replaced by a deafening roar of cosmic chaos. Colors he had no name for tore past his vision. The laws of physics that had been absent before were now a screaming, warring multitude, each trying to impose itself on him. He was no longer floating. He was being cast out, a single speck of flotsam thrown from a shipwreck into the heart of an infinite, raging storm. His last coherent thought before his senses were overwhelmed was not of his own survival, but of the impossible weight he carried within him. The ashes of a universe, entrusted to a boy who just wanted to be a hero. Then, there was only the fall. The fall was not a fall. It was a violent, chaotic birth. Izuku was torn from the placid white of his collapsing sanctuary and flung into a maelstrom of pure sensation. It was a tunnel, but one whose walls were woven from raw physics and screaming light. He saw colors that his mind had no framework for, hues that seemed to possess texture and temperature. The silence he had known was replaced by a deafening roar, the sound of a billion possibilities colliding and annihilating one another. His body, which had been weightless, was now seized by 1,000 warring gravities. He was stretched and compressed, twisted and flattened. Reality bent around him, his tattered hero's suit flickering between states of being. For a moment, he felt the familiar, coarse fabric, and in the next, it was smooth as glass, then hot as cinders, then cold as the void he just left. One for all, the arc of his dead universe, was a raging tempest within him. It was the only constant. The immense, heavy power flared, not as a weapon, but as a shield. The echoes of the vestiges, faint as they were, worked on pure instinct. Blackwhip's spectral tendrils wrapped around his essence, holding him together. Fa Jin's conceptual energy created a pocket of forward momentum, preventing him from being torn apart by the temporal currents. The core of Yoichi's will was a lighthouse in the storm, a singular point of stability shouting I am here into the chaos. He was a bullet fired through the heart of creation. The journey could have lasted an eternity, or a nanosecond. Time had no meaning in the torrent. Then, as abruptly as it began, it ended. The tunnel of chaos spat him out. The roaring ceased. The warring physics vanished. For one blissful, terrifying moment, he was back in a silent void. But this one was black, dotted with the distant, achingly familiar points of stars. And one of those points was growing larger. A blue and white marble, swelling at an impossible rate. He was going to hit it. There was no air to resist him, no way to slow down. He was a meteor, a paradox wrapped in green fabric, aimed at the heart of a sleeping world. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for an impact that would surely obliterate him and a significant portion of whatever continent was unlucky enough to be his target. He braced for fire. For annihilation. For the final, merciful end. He got grass. The impact was shockingly, impossibly gentle. One moment he was a projectile moving at translight speeds, the next he was lying on his back in soft, cool grass. The kinetic energy of his re-entry seemingly vanished into thin air. He lay there, stunned, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. A gentle breeze whispered across his face, carrying with it the scent of chlorophyll, damp earth, and something vaguely floral. It was the most real thing he had experienced in what felt like a lifetime. He took a breath, a real, ragged, desperate gasp, and his lungs filled with cool, clean air. It was a revelation. He coughed, his body remembering how to process oxygen, his throat raw from screams that had made no sound. The next sensation was warmth. A gentle, golden warmth spreading across his skin. He cracked his eyes open. Above him was a sky of the most brilliant, perfect blue, marred only by a few wispy white clouds. A yellow sun, impossibly bright after the featureless white of his prison, beat down on him, making him squint. Then came the sound. A bird chirping a simple, cheerful melody from a nearby branch. The distant laughter of a child. The low hum of traffic. Izuku pushed himself up onto his elbows, his head swimming. His body felt immensely heavy, shackled by a gravity it hadn't felt in an age. The world spun for a moment before settling. He was in a park. A perfectly ordinary, peaceful park. Green, manicured lawns stretched out before him, dotted with oak trees and flower beds bursting with color. A paved path wound its way past benches and a small, brightly colored playground. It was jarring. It was painfully, soul-crushingly normal. He looked down at himself. His suit was a wreck. The metal plates were cracked, the green fabric torn in a dozen places. The reinforced glove on his right hand was shredded, revealing scraped and bloody knuckles. He was a vision of battle, a soldier dropped fresh from a war zone into a bucolic paradise. A few people strolling along the path glanced at him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern, the way one might look at a victim of a strange accident, or a particularly committed cosplayer who had had a very bad day. He needed to move. His hero training, buried under layers of shock and cosmic grief, clawed its way to the surface. Assess. Analyze. Blend in. He staggered to his feet, his legs trembling. Every joint ached with a profound weariness. One for all was still there, a low, thrumming hum in his bones, but it felt different now. No longer the contained arc in the void, it was a singularity of impossible energy crammed into a mortal shell, straining against the laws of a reality it was not born from. It made the air around him feel thick, like the world itself was trying to process his existence. He stumbled out of the park and onto a city street. His breath caught in his throat. He knew this place. Or rather, he almost knew it. The layout was eerily familiar, the curve of the street, the placement of the main intersections. It was Multiverse. But it was all wrong. The buildings were shorter, more uniform. The towering, gleaming structures of hero agencies, emblazoned with their bold logos, were absent. In their place stood mundane corporate offices with names he didn't recognize. The support gear shops, the hero merchandise stores, the themed cafes, all gone, replaced by ordinary clothing stores, electronics shops, and quiet little bookstores. The people were different too. They walked with a certain ease, a lack of tension in their shoulders. No one was glancing at the sky, watching for falling debris or flying villains. Their attention was on their phones, on the conversations they were having, on the simple act of getting from one place to another. There was a peacefulness to their posture that he hadn't realized was missing from his own world until he saw it here. His heart began to pound, a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. This wasn't just a different city. This was a different world. The possibility, a terrifying seed planted in the chaos of his interdimensional fall, began to sprout. He needed to be sure. He closed his eyes, ducking into a narrow alleyway between a bakery and an office supply store. The smell of fresh bread was achingly familiar, a ghost of a memory of his mother's kitchen. He pushed it aside, focusing. He reached out with his senses, not his eyes or ears, But with the gift from the fourth user, he activated danger sense. He braced himself for the usual cacophony, the low-level thrum of 1,000 potential dangers in a bustling city. A car about to run a red light, a purse snatcher sizing up a target, the faint psychic residue of a villain's malevolent intent. He expected the familiar sharp sting behind his eyes, the headache that was a constant companion. He received nothing. Absolute, profound silence. The quirk was active. He could feel the faint energy signature of it within him. But it was a radio receiver in a world with no broadcasts. It was an alarm bell in a world with no fire. The silence from danger sense was more terrifying than any scream it had ever produced. It told him, with chilling certainty, that there were no malicious quirks to sense. No out-of-control powers. No simmering villainy waiting to erupt. There were no threats because there were no quirks. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his shock. He stumbled back out onto the street, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He looked at the people walking by, a woman with elegantly styled hair, a man in a business suit, a teenager with headphones. Normal. Also devastatingly, completely normal. No one had horns. No one had an extra set of arms. No one's skin was made of rock. He saw a large public video screen mounted on the side of a building, the kind that in his world would be broadcasting hero rankings or news of a recent villain takedown. He stopped, staring up at it, his blood running cold. A news anchor with perfect hair and a professional smile was talking. And the latest offering from a global tech giant has smashed all previous sales records. The Omni 7 smartphone boasts a revolutionary new processor and a camera suite that experts are calling a game-changer. The screen cut to images of people lining up outside a store, cheering as they held up sleek, minimalist boxes. The top news story, the event that had captured the world's attention, was a new phone. Izuku felt his knees go weak. He leaned against the rough brick of a wall for support, his breathing shallow. No heroes. No villains. No quirks. Just technology. Commerce. A world that had continued on a path his had diverged from over 2 centuries ago, back when a single child was born, glowing with an inner light. This world had never had a glowing baby. He was an anomaly. A paradox. A living, breathing impossibility in a world that had no framework to understand what he was. The weight of his solitude, which had been a crushing grief for his lost world, transformed. It became a profound, terrifying alienation. He wasn't just the last survivor. He was the only one of his kind. He needed proof. Hard, undeniable, intellectual proof to silence the screaming sliver of hope in his mind that insisted this was all an elaborate illusion, a powerful quirk designed to break him. He spotted a sign down the street, Multiverse Public Library. He moved, his tattered costume drawing more strange looks. He didn't care. He walked like a man possessed, his focus narrowed to that single building. He pushed through the glass doors, the sudden hush of the library a stark contrast to his inner turmoil. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and reading glasses, looked up at him, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. "My goodness, young man, are you all right? Did you have an accident?" she asked, her voice soft. "I'm fine," Izuku mumbled, his voice hoarse. "History. I need the history section." She pointed him towards a row of shelves in the back, her brows still furrowed with worry. He ignored it and marched towards his destination, his one remaining iron-soled boot making a heavy, rhythmic clomp on the linoleum floor that seemed to echo the pounding of his heart. He found the history section and pulled a terminal from the wall, his hands trembling as he typed into the search bar. "Search quirk. No results found." "Did you mean quark?" His heart sank. He tried again. "Search meta-ability. No results found." "Search superpower. Results found for superpower, political science term. The Superpower, 1982 film, essays on Nietzsche's Superman, philosophy." His fingers flew across the keyboard, his desperation growing with each failed search. "Search, All Might. No results found." "Did you mean All Might Pest Control Service?" The result was so mundane, so insulting to the memory of the symbol of peace, that a choked, hysterical laugh escaped Izuku's lips. It sounded like a sob. He tried Endeavor. "Hawks. Best Genist. Mirko. Nothing. They didn't exist. They had never existed. His final, desperate search was for the origin of it all. He navigated to the historical archives, searching for the early 21st century. He looked for news articles, medical journals, anything about a glowing baby born in Qingqing, China. He looked for the chaos that followed, the breakdown of society, the rise of vigilantes, and the eventual dawn of the Age of Heroes. He found nothing. The history of this world was seamless. The 21st century saw the rise of the Internet, the boom of global technology, political shifts, climate change concerns, a history he recognized, but one that was eerily uninterrupted. There was no cataclysmic biological event. There was no sudden evolution. Humanity had just kept going. He sank into a nearby chair, the terminal screen reflecting the utter despair on his face. It was true. All of it. He was in a different reality, a branch of the multiverse where the thing that had defined his entire existence, the dream he had clawed and bled for, had never even been a possibility. In his world, he was the ninth wielder of One for All, the successor to the symbol of peace, a hero who stood on the front lines against the greatest evil. In this world, he was a freak. A monster. His very biology was a violation of this world's natural laws. The immense power coiled within him, the legacy of 9 generations and the ghost of a dead universe, had no place here. It was a nuclear warhead in a world that had never invented gunpowder. He was a god among mortals who had no concept of divinity. The weight of this realization was heavier than any physical burden he had ever carried. It was a loneliness so profound it threatened to extinguish the very fire of his soul. He wasn't just without his friends and family. He was without context. He was a story with no book to belong in. He stumbled out of the library, the librarian calling after him in concern, but her voice barely registered. He walked aimlessly, his feet carrying him through the familiar yet alien streets. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The sight was beautiful, and that beauty was a fresh torment. A world so peaceful, so lovely, and he was utterly, irrevocably alone in it. His wandering feet eventually led him back to where he started, the park. It was emptier now, families having gone home for dinner. The playground, however, was not quite deserted. He heard a sound that cut through his stupor, a sound his entire being was hardwired to respond to. The sound of a child crying. He looked over towards the swing set. And his world, which had already ended once, ended all over again. Sitting on the ground, his small fists rubbing at his tear-filled eyes, was a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old. He had a wild mop of untamable, green-black hair. His face, chubby with youth, was dusted with the same pattern of freckles that Izuku saw in the mirror every morning. He was wearing a bright blue t-shirt, and on the front was a stylized, cartoonish image of a familiar, V-shaped haircut and a brilliant, toothy smile. It was an all-might shirt. A woman with long, dark green hair knelt beside him, her face a mask of gentle concern. It was his mother. Or a version of his mother. She looked younger, less worn by the constant worry of having a reckless hero for a son. "Come on, sweetie, what's wrong?" "Inko Midoriya, this world's Inko Midoriya," asked, her voice the same soft, loving melody he remembered from his own childhood. The little boy sniffled, pointing a chubby finger at 2 other boys who were running away, laughing. They said I was a baby," he sobbed. "They said heroes aren't real and my shirt is for babies." Inko sighed, pulling her son into a hug. "Oh, Izuku. You know that's just an old cartoon. Heroes like that aren't real. It's just a story." The words, meant to be comforting, were a physical blow to the older Izuku. "It's just a story." The little boy, his face buried in his mother's shoulder, let out a heart-wrenching, hiccuping sob. His voice was muffled but clear, a cry that echoed across time and space to pierce the heart of the lone survivor watching from the shadows. "But I still want to be a hero." Izuku fell to his knees behind the cover of a large oak tree, his one good hand pressed against the rough bark to keep from collapsing entirely. He was staring at a perfect, cruel parody of his own past. He was looking at himself. A version of himself who would grow up in a world where his dream was, and always would be, impossible. A boy whose desperate yearning would never be answered by a skeletal man on a rooftop declaring, "You can become a hero." This Izuku's dream would simply fade. It would become a childish fantasy he would grow out of, a story he once loved. The full, crushing weight of his reality finally descended upon him. He had survived the death of his universe. He had been spared the fate of everyone he had ever loved. He had inherited the power of a cosmos, and his reward was to be stranded in a world that served as a constant, living monument to his own lost hope. He was watching the ghost of his own past, a past where his greatest wish was granted, while the boy in front of him was living the reality where it was denied. The last vestiges of his strength gave out. He slid down the trunk of the tree, slumping onto the cool grass. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to hold his fracturing soul together. The pain of losing Ochako, the grief for All Might, the phantom agony of watching Bakugo vanish, it was all there. But now, it was dwarfed by a new, more terrible feeling, the feeling of absolute, infinite, and eternal solitude. Izuku Midoriya, the ninth wielder of One for All, the last survivor of a murdered multiverse, buried his face in his knees and wept in the encroaching twilight of a world that was not his own. He was the loneliest being in all of creation. The twilight deepened into the bruised purple of a city night, and with it, the artificial lights of Muzurifu began to bloom. Street lamps cast cones of lonely orange light, and the windows of distant apartment buildings became a mosaic of warm, inviting squares. Each light was a tiny beacon of a life being lived, a family gathering for dinner, a student studying, a couple watching a movie. Each light was a dagger in Izuku Midoriya's heart. He couldn't stay in the park. The sight of his younger, innocent self, cradled in the arms of a mother who would never have to fear for his life, was a torment he could no longer bear. The memory of the boy's sob, "But I still want to be a hero," was seared into his mind, a mocking echo of his own origin story, now twisted into a tragedy of mundanity. He had to move. He was a ghost in this world, and ghosts belonged in the shadows. With a groan that was equal parts physical agony and spiritual exhaustion, he pushed himself up from the base of the oak tree. His tattered hero costume, a symbol of hope and defiance in his own world, was a liability here. It was a beacon of strangeness, a freak flag in a world that prized normalcy. He pulled the ragged hood over his wild green hair and began to walk, hugging the shadows, moving away from the vibrant city center and towards the darker, quieter industrial districts that fringed the metropolitan area. Every step was a conscious effort. Gravity felt like a physical weight on his shoulders, a constant reminder that he was a foreign object, subject to laws that were not his own. The air, which had tasted so sweet and real, now felt heavy, each breath a reminder that he was breathing a world's air that he had no right to. He found his sanctuary in decay. An old, forgotten section of the city's industrial heart, where factories had shut down decades ago, leaving behind husks of brick and rusted steel. He found a warehouse, its windows long shattered, a chain-link fence surrounding it peeled back like an open wound. The large rolling door was jammed half open, creating a dark, gaping maw. It smelled of rust, stagnant water, and the slow, patient decay of forgotten things. It was perfect. He slipped inside, the darkness wrapping around him like a shroud. The last of the ambient city light filtered through the broken windows high on the walls, casting long, skeletal shadows across the vast, empty concrete floor. Dust motes, thick as insects, danced in these pale beams of light. The space was cavernous, echoing with the drip of water from some unseen leak, a lonely metronome counting out the seconds of his solitude. He stumbled to the center of the vast space and collapsed, his body finally surrendering to its exhaustion. He lay on his back, staring up at the dark, web-choked rafters, and let the full, crushing weight of his survivor's guilt consume him. The image of his younger self was the key that unlocked the prison of his composure. Why him? The question hammered at his skull with the force of a Detroit smash. Why was he, Izuku Midoriya, the one chosen to live? He had spent his life chasing a dream that was impossible, only to be granted a miracle. This other Izuku, this innocent child on the playground, would never get that miracle. His dream would wither and die, starved of the hope that All Might had given him. Wasn't that boy more deserving of a simple, peaceful life than he was? He, who had thrown his life away a dozen times, who had courted death and destruction in the name of a title. He felt like a thief. He had stolen a life, stolen a reality. He was a glitch, an error in the cosmic code, and his continued existence felt like a profanity against the memory of those who were gone. The faces of his friends swam in the darkness above him. Not their final, horrifying moments of dissolution, but the quiet moments in between. He saw Uraraka. Her face flushed with excitement as she demonstrated a new grappling technique, her laughter bright and infectious as she accidentally floated herself to the ceiling of the gym. He remembered the warmth of her hand during the school festival, the fierce determination in her eyes when she defended him against the crowd. He had been so close to telling her everything. Now the words would remain unsaid for all eternity, ashes in a dead universe. He saw Ada, his arm chopping the air with rigid precision as he lectured them about dormitory rules, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his face that betrayed his fondness for his chaotic classmates. He remembered Ida's desperate, vengeful rage against Stain, and the pride he felt seeing him grow into a true leader, a worthy successor to the name Ingenium. He saw Todoroki, stoic and silent, creating a small, perfect bird out of ice with his right hand, then gently melting it with his left, a quiet demonstration of the balance he had finally found. He remembered their battle, the clash of fire and ice, the moment he had broken through to the lonely boy behind the wall of power. He had helped Todoroki find himself, and in return, Todoroki had become one of his staunchest, most loyal friends. And Kaken. His mind conjured the image of Bakugo, not roaring in defiance at the end, but hunched over a textbook, a rare look of intense, quiet concentration on his face as he struggled to keep his grades at the top of the class. He remembered their second fight, the raw, painful honesty of it, the moment their rivalry had finally, truly transformed into a bond of mutual respect. Bakugo had apologized. He had acknowledged him. After a lifetime of conflict, they had finally been on their way to becoming true partners, true friends. He had failed them. All of them. He was the wielder of One for All, the quirk designed to save, to protect, to be a beacon of hope. And when the end came, he hadn't saved anyone. He had floated in a bubble of stolen reality while his entire world, everyone and everything he had ever sworn to protect, was unmade. His power hadn't been a shield for them, it had only been a shield for him. It should have been me, he whispered into the cavernous silence of the warehouse. The words were swallowed by the immense space, yet they echoed in his soul with deafening clarity. I should have died with them. The grief was a physical thing, a black hole in his chest, pulling everything inward. He curled into a ball on the cold concrete, the dust and grime sticking to his tattered suit, and he wept. Not the silent, choked sobs from the void, but racking, gut-wrenching wails of a boy who had lost his entire world. The hero was gone, the symbol was gone, all that was left was a heartbroken teenager, alone in the dark. How long he lay there, he didn't know. Minutes bled into hours. The moonbeams crawling across the floor were his only clock. The despair was a tide, pulling him under. It would be so easy to let go. To just stop. To let the impossible energy churning inside him burn itself out, and him with it. To join them in the nothingness. But as he teetered on the edge of that abyss, a warmth spread through his chest. It was faint, like the last embers of a dying fire, but it was there. It was a familiar warmth, a feeling he associated with the core of his power. Don't. The thought was not his own. It was a gentle pressure, a sense of a hand on his shoulder. It was a feeling of encouragement, of a sad but unwavering belief. He pushed himself up, wiping the grime and tears from his face with the back of his tattered glove. He couldn't give up. It would be a betrayal. A betrayal of their sacrifice. All Might's final smile. Nana Shimura's desperate, loving push. The silent, grim determination of all the vestiges as they burned themselves away to forge his lifeboat. Their final act had been to save him. To give up now would be to spit on their graves. He crossed his legs, straightened his back, and closed his eyes. The pain and grief were still there, a roaring sea, but he needed to find the shore. He needed to find answers. He focused inward, past the ache in his bones and the agony in his heart, pushing down into the core of his being, towards the raging, paradoxical storm that was One for All. He plunged into the mindscape. It was as he remembered it from the final moments in the void, a ruin floating in an endless expanse of non-existence. A small, spherical island of shattered reality. The floor of the vestiges chamber was a collection of floating debris, orbiting a central point of stability. The chairs were cracked and faded, ghostly afterimages of their former selves. The oppressive, featureless white he had seen through the cracks in his lifeboat was the ever-present sky outside their fragile bubble. But this time, he wasn't a visitor. This was his space now. The lifeboat dimension had fully integrated with his consciousness. He was the anchor, the floating debris, his own fractured psyche. He sought the echoes, the lingering remnants of the souls who had given everything for him. He reached out, not with a voice, but with a feeling, a question. What do I do? The first to answer was Nana Shimura. Her echo was the most defined, a soft, shimmering outline of a woman in a hero's cape. She drifted towards him, her presence a wave of pure, undiluted compassion. It wasn't a voice that answered, but a feeling that bloomed in his chest, the same warmth that had pulled him from the brink of despair. It was the feeling of a mother's hug, the memory of a kind word on a bad day. Accompanying the feeling was a single, powerful image projected into his mind, a tiny sprout, green and vibrant, pushing its way through cracked, barren earth towards the sun. Live, her echo seemed to whisper. Grow. Don't let this be the end. It was a plea, a prayer from a ghost who had already seen too much loss. Then, a different presence asserted itself. It was cold, sharp, and intensely pragmatic. The faint, angular silhouettes of the second and third users seemed to sharpen, their collective will cutting through Nana's warmth like a surgeon's scalpel. There was no comfort from them, no compassion. There was only pressure. A feeling of being scrutinized, analyzed, and found wanting. Their message was not a feeling or an image, but a pure, crystalline concept, a shard of tactical logic inserted directly into his thoughts. Emotion is a liability. Grief is a distraction. You are alive. You possess the asset. Analyze the asset. Understand its function. Control it. All else is irrelevant. It was jarring, the shift from Nana's gentle plea to their cold command, but it was effective. It was the splash of icy water on the face of a hysteric. It forced him to shift his focus from what he had lost to what he had left. And beneath it all, a third presence made itself known. It was not a voice or an image or a feeling. It was a foundation, a constant, steady hum that resonated from the very center of the mindscape, from the glowing, stable core that was the echo of Yoichi Shigaraki, the first user. His presence didn't offer advice or commands. It was simply there. An unwavering anchor of pure, selfless will. It was the original intent of the quirk, refined over a century of struggle into a single, immutable principle. The thought it projected was simple, a load-bearing wall for his collapsing sanity. Protect. Live. Analyze. Protect. The three fragmented commands from the ghosts in his soul formed a new mantra. They were a lifeline thrown into the sea of his despair. He clung to it, pulling himself back to a semblance of stability. His spiritual form faded, and he was back in the warehouse, the dust motes still dancing in the moonlight. His eyes opened. The grief was still there, a great, gaping wound in his soul, but it was no longer all-consuming. He had a purpose, however faint. He looked down at his right hand. The second and third were right. He needed to understand the asset. He needed to understand what One for All had become. He held his hand out, palm up, and focused. He reached for his power, not with the explosive intent of a smash, but with the delicate touch of a scientist examining a specimen. In his old world, activating One for All was like flipping a switch. A circuit would close, and power would flood his limbs, heralded by a surge of green lightning and a feeling of limitless energy. This was different. Reaching for the power now was like lowering a bucket into an infinitely deep well. As he drew upon it, he felt its immense, terrifying weight. It wasn't just energy. It was mass. It was memory. It was the condensed ghost of 1 trillion dying suns and 1 billion souls. The power that answered his call was sluggish, thick like liquid starlight, and impossibly dense. A soft light began to emanate from his palm. But it wasn't the clean, vibrant green he was used to. This light was a milky, pale green, and it was mottled with countless pinpricks of other colors, deep blues, fiery reds, impossible violets. It was as if he were holding a newborn galaxy in his hand. The familiar crackle of lightning was gone, replaced by a low, resonant hum. It wasn't a sound his ears could hear, but a vibration he felt in the marrow of his bones, a deep, mournful song of a universe that was no more. He stared, mesmerized and terrified. He could feel it, the latent energy of his entire reality, coiled within his very being. The arc. He noticed something else. The dust motes dancing in the moonbeam above his hand had stopped. They were frozen in place, suspended in the air, captured in the strange gravitational field his power was emitting. As he channeled a fraction more energy, the motes didn't just freeze. They began to slowly drift backwards, retracing their paths through the air as if time itself were stuttering around his palm. He snatched his hand back, cutting off the flow of power. The hum ceased. The galaxy in his palm vanished. The dust motes resumed their lazy dance, oblivious. The air around him shimmered for a moment, like heat haze on a summer road, before settling. Reality itself had been warped by that small display. The laws of this world had been momentarily overwritten by the phantom physics of his own. This power was not a tool. It was a contagion. A paradox he carried that threatened to unravel the fabric of this new, fragile world just by existing. He had to control it. He had to understand it. He stood up, moving to a clear space in the center of the warehouse. His mind, the same analytical mind that had filled notebooks with hero analysis for years, took over. It was a comfort, a return to a familiar process in an unfamiliar world. Observation 1. The power is no longer purely kinetic. It has a temporal and gravitational effect on its immediate surroundings. He needed a bigger test. He took a familiar stance, the one he had practiced a million times. Left foot back, right arm cocked. He wasn't going to punch anything. He was going to punch the air. He would aim for a 1% smash. A gentle puff of air, by his old standards. He drew on the power again, feeling its immense weight settle into his arm. He focused, trying to channel only the physical, kinetic aspect of it, to force this new, strange energy into the familiar shape of a smash. Detroit. Smash, he whispered, the words feeling foreign and hollow in the silence. He pushed his fist forward. The result was not a puff of air. There was no shockwave, no boom of displaced atmosphere. The first thing that happened was a flicker. The entire warehouse, for a single, terrifying instant, seemed to lose its color, desaturating to shades of gray. A split second later, the color rushed back in. The second thing was the sound. A sharp crack like shattering glass echoed through the space, but it arrived a fraction of a second before his fist reached its full extension. The third thing was the visual distortion. The air in front of his fist didn't compress. It tore. For a fleeting moment, he saw a small, ragged hole in reality, a window into the chaotic, multicolored void he had fallen through. Then, with another crack, it snapped shut. A ripple, like a stone dropped in a pond of space-time, spread out from the point of impact, causing the walls of the warehouse to seem to warp and twist before settling back to normal. Izuku stood there, arm extended, panting. His 1% punch had torn a momentary hole in the universe. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. What was that? The second and third's cold logic provided an answer, a sudden flash of insight. He wasn't just stockpiling physical power anymore. One for All had stockpiled the very concept of his old reality. When he used it, he wasn't just moving his fist. He was imposing a piece of his dead universe onto this one. The clash of fundamental laws was what created the distortion. The sound arriving early, the color draining, those were the symptoms of two different operating systems trying to run on the same hardware at once. This power was infinitely more dangerous than he had ever imagined. A full-powered smash, it wouldn't just level a city block. It might erase it from existence. It might tear a permanent wound in the fabric of this reality. He was a walking, talking cosmological disaster. The thought sent a fresh wave of horror through him. He fell to his knees, clutching his head. What am I supposed to do with this? He groaned. The power to protect had become the power to annihilate. The ultimate heroic quirk had become the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. He needed answers. Not just about his power, but about the why. Why had his universe ended? The vestiges had called it a force, an ending. What did that mean? He closed his eyes again, sinking back into the ruined mindscape. He bypassed the echoes of the vestiges this time, pushing deeper, towards the core of the arc itself. He focused on the memory of the end, of the sky cracking and the white void pouring in. He demanded an answer from the silent library of ghosts within him. What did this? What destroyed my home? He pushed his consciousness into the deepest, most chaotic part of the power, the raw, untamed energy of a murdered cosmos. And the cosmos answered. His mindscape dissolved. The warehouse vanished. He was floating in an infinite, stardusted black. Before him lay a tapestry of unimaginable complexity and beauty. It was a representation of his home multiverse. Countless threads of light, universes, each one unique, woven together in a shimmering, intricate pattern. He could see his own thread, a bright, chaotic strand where heroes and villains battled. He could see other threads, calmer ones, stranger ones, all connected, all part of the whole. It was beautiful. It was life, in all its infinite, glorious diversity. Then, he felt it. A cold. An absolute, so freezing cold that was not the absence of heat, but the active presence of utter stillness. And from a direction that wasn't a direction it came. It wasn't a creature of flesh and bone. It wasn't a monster with claws and fangs. It was an absence. A patch of the void that was darker than the void, a hole in reality that was aware of itself. It was a wave of sentient entropy, a conscious force of nothingness that moved with a slow, deliberate, and inexorable purpose. He watched, helpless, as this great unraveling reached the edge of the multiversal tapestry. It didn't tear it or burn it. It simply touched it. And the threads it touched began to dissolve. The complex, vibrant weave of a universe, with all its history, its life, its triumphs and tragedies, frayed and unraveled, its colors fading until it was nothing more than a single, uniform, gray fiber, which was then absorbed into the nothingness. It was a solvent, and existence was the stain it was designed to remove. He could feel its intent, a cold, dispassionate thought that resonated across the void. Difference is a flaw. Complexity is a disease. Existence is a cacophony. All must return to the sublime simplicity of the one. The silence. It was not evil in the way he understood it. It had no malice, no hatred. It was a janitor, and the entirety of creation was a mess it was programmed to clean up. It viewed life, choice, and change as errors in the grand, silent equation. His vision was pulled along one of the threads. His thread. He watched in abject horror as the wave of unraveling reached his universe. He saw the sky crack. He saw the white void, the raw material of the entity's being, pour in. He watched as his friends, his family, his entire world, were not killed, but corrected. Unwritten. Erased from the story. It wasn't a natural collapse. It wasn't an accident. His world, his friends, his mother, they hadn't just died. They were murdered. The vision overwhelmed him. The echoes of the vestiges inside him flared in a silent, unified scream of remembered agony and righteous fury. The force of the revelation threw him from his meditative state. He was back in the warehouse, gasping on the concrete floor, his body drenched in a cold sweat. The sun was rising, its first weak rays painting the dusty air in shades of gray and rose. A new day was dawning on a world he didn't belong to. The grief was still there. The loneliness was still there. But now, they were joined by something new. Something cold, and hard and sharp. Rage. A pure, incandescent rage born of profound injustice. His loss was no longer a tragic accident of cosmic proportions. It was a crime. An assassination on a multiversal scale. And he was the sole witness. He pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling not with weakness, but with a terrible, newfound strength. He looked at his hand, the hand that could tear holes in reality. It was no longer just the cursed remnant of a dead world. It was a weapon. He was no longer just a survivor. He was the last soldier in a war he hadn't even known was being fought. The great unraveling had murdered his reality, and it was still out there, dormant, digesting its meal. And he, the indigestible morsel, was a loose end. He was no longer just a ghost haunted by his past. He was a ghost who was going to haunt back. The first rays of the morning sun cut through the grime-caked upper windows of the warehouse, lancing through the cavernous dark. They were invaders, beams of pale gold that illuminated a billion swirling dust motes, turning the stagnant air into a glittering, silent galaxy. For a moment, Izuku was mesmerized by the simple beauty of it. It was a sight from a world that was still turning, a sun that was still burning, a reality that was still blessedly, ignorantly intact. Then the memory of the vision crashed back into him, and the beauty curdled into a bitter mockery. He was on his feet, though he didn't remember standing. His body trembled, not from cold or exhaustion, but from a rage so profound and so alien it felt like a violation. It was not the hot, explosive fury of Kaken, nor the righteous, burning anger he himself had felt facing down villains like Muscular or Overhaul. This was a cold rage, an arctic, absolute fury born from witnessing a crime so vast it beggared the imagination. His world hadn't just ended. It had been murdered. Systematically, dispassionately, and completely. He clenched his fists, the tattered fabric of his right glove tearing further under the strain. The faces of his friends, his mother, All Might, they weren't just victims of a cosmic tragedy. They were the casualties of a deliberate act. An execution. The thought was a whetstone, and his grief was the blade being sharpened against it. A wave of shared feeling rose from within him, a confirmation from the echoes in his soul. Nana Shimura's presence was a spike of pure, maternal fury, the protective wrath of a mother lion whose cubs had been taken. It was a feeling he recognized from his own mother, that terrifying, quiet anger she reserved for those who truly hurt him. The second and third users' echoes resonated with a cold, hard certainty, the dispassionate agreement of soldiers confirming the identity of an enemy. And from Yoichi's core, the steady hum of protect now had a new, harder edge to it, avenge. They had all felt it in their final moments, the vestiges now conveyed. A pressure, a wrongness, a dissolving of the rules they had taken for granted. But they hadn't understood it. They were fish feeling the water drain from their ocean, with no concept of what lay beyond it. Now, through his eyes, they had seen the fisherman holding the net. The name for it coalesced in his mind, a label for the formless horror. The Great Unraveling. An architect of ruin, a philosopher of silence. It wasn't a villain, Izuku muttered, his voice a raw rasp in the echoing silence of the warehouse. He began to pace, his one good boot crunching on unseen debris, his movements sharp and agitated. This was familiar territory. The muttering, the analysis, it was his shield, his weapon, his way of imposing order on chaos. A villain has a motive. Greed, power, revenge, a twisted ideology. This is different. He stopped, turning to face a particularly bright beam of sunlight as if it were an interrogator. It doesn't hate. It doesn't gloat. It corrects. The word tasted like poison. It sees life, diversity, choice, as a flaw. A bug in the system. And it's the ultimate antivirus. He held up his hand, remembering the milky, galaxy-filled light that had emanated from it, the way it had made reality itself stutter. The power of his dead universe. The unraveling had consumed his reality, but a fragment of it, the most potent, paradoxical fragment, had survived. Inside him. You can't fight a concept, he said, the old, familiar despair trying to creep back in. His entire life, his entire methodology as a hero, was built on a simple, brutal principle: identify the threat, find its weakness, and apply overwhelming force. Punch harder. Move faster. Think smarter. But how do you punch entropy? How do you outsmart a fundamental principle of anti-existence? He ran a hand through his matted hair, tugging at the green-black locks in frustration. It's not something I can just Detroit smash into submission. A 1,000,000% smash might just give it more to unravel, more energy to dissolve. Incorrect analysis. The thought, cold and sharp, cut through his spiraling thoughts. It was the voice of the second user, a pure, tactical concept projected into his mind. It does not dissolve energy. It unwrites the laws that allow energy to be. It is a solvent for reality. Your smash did not feed it. It repelled it momentarily. You imposed one set of rules upon another, a no-reality versus a hyper-reality. They are antithetical. Izuku froze, his analytical mind seizing on the correction. He paced again, faster this time. Antithetical. Opposites. He looked at his hands. One for all is the power of connection, of passing on will, spirit, and strength from one person to another. It's a chain of life, of succession. The unraveling is the force of disconnection, of breaking things down to their simplest, most isolated state. It's an engine of endings. He stopped in the center of the warehouse. The pieces were beginning to click into place, forming a picture of horrifying clarity. It found our multiverse, he whispered. And it began to digest it. The word felt visceral, grotesque. He imagined the entity as a vast, cosmic amoeba, slowly surrounding and absorbing the tapestry of his home, breaking down the complex proteins of existence into simple, gray amino acids of nothingness. The process wasn't instantaneous. It took time. That's why we had a final battle. We were fighting the symptoms, the cracking sky, the dissolving physics, not the cause. His fist clenched again. They had been fighting a fever while the infection consumed them from within. All their power, all their sacrifice in those final moments, it had been for nothing. He sank to his knees, the cold concrete a stark reality against his legs. All of them, they're not just gone. Their very essence, the energy that made them, it's being used as fuel. The thought was the most violating of all. Uraraka's bright spirit, Bakugo's explosive will, All Might's shining hope, all of it was being broken down and assimilated, converted into more of the silent, hungry void. They were fueling the very entity that had murdered them. The rage returned, colder and sharper than before. It burned away the despair, leaving a core of diamond-hard resolve. He would not let that stand. He could not. This led him back to the most critical question. The one that had been torturing him since he awoke in the white void. Why me? He asked the dust-filled air. Why did I survive? If this thing is so absolute, so perfect in its function, why was there a single error? Why am I here? He closed his eyes, focusing inward again, demanding the answer from the silent library within. The echoes of the vestiges swirled, their fragmented knowledge coalescing around his query. The pragmatic logic of the second and third, the deep, foundational stability of Yoichi, the residual pain of Nana, they all combined, feeding him the impossible truth. He saw the unraveling again in his mind's eye, the wave of sentient nothingness. He saw it wash over his universe. But this time, he saw a single point of light that refused to be extinguished. It wasn't a brave hero standing defiant. It was a knot. A tangled, impossibly dense knot in the thread of reality that the solvent could not dissolve. One for all, the chorus of echoes whispered. The vision sharpened. He saw the power within him as it was in those final moments. A singularity of 9 generations of will, a stockpile of energy so immense it had begun to take on paradoxical properties. It was a self-contained loop, a snake eating its own tail. When the unraveling tried to unwrite the laws that governed it, it found that one for all was its own law. It was an axiom, a piece of a different equation that could not be solved by the unraveling's simple, brutal mathematics. We are a splinter, the second's logic clarified. A shard of bone in its throat. The metaphor was brutal and perfect. His survival hadn't been a miracle. It had been a glitch. A rounding error. The unraveling had swallowed his universe whole, but it had choked on him. One for all, in its final, desperate act of self-preservation, had become an indigestible splinter of otherness. The lifeboat dimension, his white prison, had been the initial immune response, the entity trying to isolate the foreign body. This realization recontextualized everything. His power wasn't just the remnant of his home, it was its antithesis. His existence wasn't a tragic accident, it was an act of rebellion. But the thought brought with it a new, chilling implication. A body does not tolerate a splinter forever. It's digesting, Izuku said, his eyes snapping open. It's sated. Dormant. But it's not gone. And it knows something is wrong. The meal isn't sitting right. He looked around the warehouse, at the solid brick walls, the steel rafters, the concrete floor. He thought of the peaceful park, the laughing children, the ordinary people on the street. This world, this new, fragile reality. I'm the splinter, he whispered, a fresh wave of cold dread washing over him. And the body will eventually try to remove me. The unraveling, it's going to come looking for me. The full weight of his situation crashed down on him, and it had nothing to do with his own survival. He was a beacon. His paradoxical energy, the ghost of his universe that he carried in his soul, was a lighthouse screaming his location into the cosmic void. And the unraveling was the only ship sailing that dark sea. When it came for him, it wouldn't be precise. It wouldn't be a targeted strike. It would be a wave of cleansing no reality, and it wouldn't care about the peaceful, mundane universe he was hiding in. It would sterilize the entire area to remove the infection. It would burn down the haystack to find the needle. His presence here, his very existence, was a death sentence for this entire world. The rage he had felt moments ago was doused by a flood of icy terror. He had found his enemy, only to realize he was leading it straight to a new world of innocent bystanders. He had thought his burden was the grief of his past, but he was wrong. His true burden was the damnation of this world's future. He scrambled to his feet, a wild, cornered look in his eyes. I have to go. I have to leave. But where could he go? He was in a universe. He couldn't just step out of it. Could he? He had fallen through the void between multiverses to get here. Could he do it again? Could he throw himself back into that chaotic ocean and become a ghost, adrift forever, leading his hunter on a chase through empty space? He focused on float, the quirk of Nana Shimura. He channeled the strange, heavy power of the arc into it, not trying to fly, but trying to disconnect himself from the world's laws, from its very fabric. The effect was subtle, then terrifying. He didn't rise into the air. Instead, the connection between his boots and the concrete floor seemed to fray. He felt a sense of dislocation, as if he were becoming a phantom. He looked down and saw a faint, shimmering aura around his feet. The dust on the floor beneath him stirred, not blown away, but vibrating with a strange energy, some of it lifting slowly, unnaturally, into the air. He wasn't just nullifying his own weight. He was locally nullifying the very constant of gravity. He pushed harder, and the sensation intensified. He felt a tearing sensation, not in his body, but in his connection to the space he occupied. He felt the cold of the in-between licking at the edges of his being. He could do it. He could tear himself free, but the second's cold logic flared in his mind. And then what, ninth? You would be a beacon in an open field, with no cover. It would find you instantly, and without a stable reality to anchor you, your own power, the arc, would consume you. You would unravel yourself from the inside out. He was trapped. Trapped by his own nature. To stay was to condemn this world. To leave was to condemn himself, and to risk the unraveling finding the arc and finally succeeding in digesting it. He was a bomb, and he had no way to defuse himself. All he could do was try to keep from being jostled. He let the power of float recede. His feet settled firmly on the concrete, the strange aura vanishing. He was once again a prisoner of this world's gravity, and he had never been so grateful for it. He stood in the center of the warehouse, breathing heavily, caught in an impossible checkmate. His rage had given him a target, but his analysis had shown him that he was the bigger threat. He was a hero. His core programming, deeper than any quirk, was to protect the innocent. And right now, the most heroic thing he could do was nothing. Hide. Suppress his power. Pretend to be human. Pray that the cosmic horror he had escaped would stay asleep. It was a coward's choice. It was the antithesis of everything All Might had taught him, of everything he had ever strived to be. Plus ultra. Go beyond. But there was no beyond here. There was only the hope of being overlooked. As he stood there, wrestling with the bitter taste of his own helplessness, he felt it. It started as a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the warehouse. A sudden, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The low, mournful hum of the arc within him, which had been a constant background noise, suddenly pitched higher, a low thrum of alarm. Then, his own internal alarm went off. Danger sense, the quirk of the fourth user, which had been utterly, profoundly silent since his arrival, exploded. It wasn't the familiar sharp sting behind the eyes, the low-grade headache of sensing a nearby threat. This was a psychic grand mal seizure. It was a billion sirens blaring at once inside his skull. It was a feeling of pure, undiluted, existential dread that made his vision flash white and his knees buckle. The echo of Haikyuu Shinomori in his mindscape was no longer a wisp, It was a silent, incandescent nova of pure terror. It's here. The thought was a unified scream from all the vestiges. Izuku fell to the concrete, clutching his head as the sheer force of the warning overloaded his senses. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, what it was. It wasn't here physically. Not yet. It was a probe. A psychic tendril, cast out from the slumbering mass of the great unraveling as it stirred in its post-meal torpor. A flicker of consciousness, checking on the source of its indigestion. He could feel its approach. It was a cold, deliberate thoughtform, moving through the cosmic substrate, the space between realities. He could sense it brushing past other universes, threads in the tapestry he had seen, ignoring them, focused with a terrifying, singular purpose. It was homing in on the unique signature of the arc, the paradoxical energy he held within him. The feeling was utterly alien. It was a spider's thread, impossibly long and thin, brushing against the outside of his consciousness. There was no emotion behind it. No anger, no malice. Just a cold, clinical curiosity. It was the dispassionate attention of a physician examining a strange growth. The sensation was more violating than any hatred he had ever faced. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to shrink his presence, to make the brilliant lighthouse of his soul into a tiny, flickering candle. He suppressed the arc, shoving the immense power down, trying to cloak it in the mundane energy of the world around him. He tried to mimic the quiet, simple souls of this reality, to put on a psychic camouflage. The tendril drew closer. He could feel it casting about, the psychic equivalent of a searchlight sweeping a dark field. It swept past him once. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a moment, he thought it might have missed him. The pressure lessened. Then, it snapped back. The tendril of thought, the extension of the unraveling's will, touched him. The contact was not a psychic attack. It was a simple, clinical touch. There you are. The thought was not in words, but in a pure, conceptual data packet that his mind, through the lens of one for all, could translate. The anomaly. The error. The flaw in the perfection. For a terrifying instant, he felt his own consciousness being catalogued, analyzed, and dismissed. The entity saw the arc within him, saw the ghosts of his reality, saw the tangled knot of willpower and paradoxical energy. It did not understand it, but it recognized it as foreign, as other, as something that did not belong in its clean, orderly silence. The contact lasted only for a second, but in that second, Izuku Midoriya knew a terror deeper than any he had ever imagined. He was no longer just a survivor. He was no longer just a witness. He was a target. Marked for deletion. The tendril withdrew, its purpose fulfilled. It receded back through the void, carrying its report back to the slumbering beast that had spawned it. The psychic pressure vanished. Danger sense subsided from a soul-shattering scream to a frantic, high-pitched wail that was still leagues beyond anything he had ever felt before. The unnatural chill in the warehouse dissipated. Izuku was left gasping on the floor, trembling violently. He was drenched in sweat, his vision swimming. He had been seen. He had been found. The unraveling was dormant now, but it wouldn't be forever. The probe was a promise. It was the precursor to action. He didn't know if he had days, or hours, or minutes, but he knew, with an absolute and chilling certainty, that it was coming for him. And it would bring the end of this world with it. He pushed himself up, his movements stiff, his eyes wide with a terror that had burned past fear and into a desperate, frantic clarity. The choice had been made for him. Hiding was no longer an option. Passivity was no longer an option. The hunt had begun. And he could not afford to be the prey. The terror was a physical entity. It was a block of ice in Izuku's stomach and a swarm of wasps in his veins. The psychic touch of the unraveling had been more violating than any physical blow he had ever endured. It was the clinical, dispassionate gaze of a god inspecting an insect just before crushing it. He had been found. He was marked. Panic, primal and absolute, seized him. His hero training, his analytical mind, his resolve, all of it was sandblasted away by a single, overwhelming instinct: run. He scrambled up from the concrete floor of the warehouse, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The building, his sanctuary of decay, now felt like a cage. The single point of contact with the unraveling had turned it into a compromised location, a ground zero. He had to get away. He had to sever the connection. His first instinct was to tear his hero's suit off. It was the last physical link to his old life, the uniform of the man the unraveling was hunting. He tore at the cracked armor plates and shredded fabric, his fingers clumsy with haste. The tough material resisted, but he ripped at it with a desperate, panic strength, the sound of tearing fabric loud in the morning silence. He peeled it off his body, leaving him in the simple black compression shirt and pants he wore underneath. The suit, the symbol of his dream, lay in a discarded heap on the floor, a hollow green shell. It looked like a fallen hero, and the sight sent a fresh stab of grief through him. But the panic was stronger. He had to disappear. Not just physically, but psychically. The unraveling had homed in on the unique, powerful energy signature of the arc within him. He was a lighthouse in a world of candles. To survive, to protect this world, he had to become a candle himself. He closed his eyes, focusing inward with frantic intensity. He imagined the raging, paradoxical storm of One for All, the galaxy of dead souls and cosmic power. Then, with a grunt of effort, he began to suppress it. It was like trying to force a star into a shoebox. He mentally built walls around it, thick, leaden walls of denial and will. He tried to smother its light, to muffle its song. The power resisted, its very nature being to grow and to shine, but he pushed back with all the desperation of a man trying to hold a bursting dam with his bare hands. The effort was excruciating. It was a constant, active strain, a psychic muscle being flexed to its absolute limit. A crushing pressure built in his head and chest, and his body trembled with the effort. He felt weaker, smaller. The air around him, which had always felt thick and distorted by his presence, began to feel normal. The low, resonant hum in his bones faded to a barely perceptible vibration. He had dimmed the lighthouse. But it was a constant, exhausting battle to keep the light from flaring back to life. Next, he needed to blend in physically. He looked a mess. His compression gear was filthy and torn, his face smeared with grime, his hair a wild, unkempt disaster. He looked like a fugitive, which, he supposed, he was. He slipped out of the warehouse, his senses on high alert. Danger Sense was still screaming, a high-pitched, continuous wail of anxiety that gave him a splitting headache, a constant reminder that the cosmic threat was aware of him, even if it wasn't actively hunting him at this moment. He moved through the dawnlit industrial streets, a ghost in the urban landscape. He found a homeless shelter with a donation bin out back. With a pang of guilt, he rummaged through it, finding a pair of worn-out jeans that were a bit too short, a faded gray hoodie, and a pair of beat-up sneakers. Changing into them, he felt the last vestiges of Deku, the hero, sloughing off. Now, he was just another anonymous young man down on his luck. The clothes were loose and smelled faintly of dust and someone else's life, but they were a perfect camouflage. He pulled the hood up, shadowing his face, and joined the river of humanity as the city began to wake up. He needed a job. Not just for money, which he had none of, but for a routine. For a purpose, however mundane. A job would force him into the rhythm of this world, anchor him in its normalcy. It would be another layer to his psychic camouflage, a way to tell the universe, I belong here. I am not an anomaly. He spent 2 days in a blur of fear and exhaustion. He slept in alleyways, the cold seeping into his bones, his body aching from the constant strain of suppressing his power. He ate what little he could afford after doing odd, under-the-table jobs, hauling trash for a restaurant, sweeping a storefront. Every person he passed, every car that drove by, was a potential threat in his paranoid mind, though Danger Sense remained at its high, steady hum, never spiking. On the 3rd day, he saw a help-wanted sign taped to the window of a small, independent coffee shop. The Daily Grind. It was tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore, a cozy-looking place with warm lighting and the rich, inviting aroma of coffee and baked goods spilling out onto the sidewalk. It looked safe. Taking a deep, steadying breath, he pushed the door open. A small bell chimed. The place was bustling with the morning rush. The air was thick with conversation, the hiss of an espresso machine, and the clatter of ceramic mugs. It was a symphony of normal life. Behind the counter, a young woman with a sharp, intelligent face was working with practiced efficiency. She had dark, choppy purple hair with 2 longer bangs framing her face, and a series of small silver earrings climbing up one ear. She wore a black apron over a band t-shirt, and her expression was one of bored professionalism. She looked over at him, her gaze sweeping over his worn clothes and hooded face with a flicker of something unreadable in her dark eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dry and a little impatient. I saw the sign," Izuku stammered, pulling his hood down. He felt incredibly exposed. "The help wanted sign." She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. Her eyes, he noticed, were sharp and observant. They seemed to see more than he was comfortable with. "Ever worked as a barista?" "No," he admitted. "Ever worked a cash register?" "No." "Ever worked in food service at all?" "No." She sighed, a dramatic, long-suffering sound. "Right. So, you have literally no useful skills. Why should my boss hire you?" Izuku's mind went blank. Why should he hire him? He was a walking cosmological disaster with no resume and clothes from a donation bin. But he was also desperate. He thought of his mother, of the kindness in her eyes. "I'm a fast learner," he said, the words coming out with more conviction than he felt. "I'm strong, I can handle the heavy lifting, stocking, cleaning, anything. And I really need the work. I'll work harder than anyone." His earnestness seemed to take her by surprise. Her cynical facade cracked for a fraction of a second. She studied his face, her gaze lingering on the scattering of freckles and the deep, haunted exhaustion in his green eyes. She saw something there, not a threat, but a profound sadness. A story he wasn't telling. She sighed again, but this time it was less dramatic. "Taka-san! We got one!" She called towards a back room. An older, kindly-looking man with a bald head and a warm smile emerged, wiping his hands on his own apron. He was Taka-san, the owner. The woman, whose name he learned was Akari, relayed Izuku's complete lack of qualifications with a sarcastic flair. But Taka-san just smiled. He looked at Izuku with the same discerning eye as Akari, but his saw something different. He saw desperation, yes, but also a core of sincere, earnest integrity. He hired him for a trial run, and so, Izuku Midoriya, the 9th wielder of One for All, became a trainee barista and glorified janitor at the daily grind. The work was both mind-numbingly mundane and terrifyingly complex. He learned to steam milk without scalding it, to pull a decent shot of espresso, to remember the difference between a latte and a cappuccino. Akari was his reluctant trainer, a mentor armed with a razor-sharp wit and a complete lack of patience for his clumsiness. She nicknamed him Mophead because of his untamable hair and his frequent assignment to mop the floors. "No, Mophead, you hold the pitcher level," she'd say, grabbing his hand to correct his angle. "Are you trying to make foam or a science experiment?" He fumbled. He dropped things. He gave customers the wrong change. His mind, used to processing battle tactics and quirk analysis at lightning speed, struggled with the simple, rhythmic demands of customer service. The constant strain of suppressing the arc made him feel foggy and slow, his reflexes dulled, but he persisted. He worked with a grim, quiet determination that slowly began to earn Akari's grudging respect. He never complained. He did every task he was given, no matter how menial. He stayed late to scrub the floors until they shone, and he was the first to arrive in the morning to help Taka-san take inventory. In these quiet, repetitive tasks, he found a strange sort of peace. The physical labor grounded him. The need to focus on the perfect swirl of foam in a latte was a welcome distraction from the cosmic horror humming just beneath the surface of his consciousness. He was building a new life, one monotonous, exhausting moment at a time, and he started to see the world he was hiding in. From his vantage point behind the counter, he watched the endless parade of humanity. He saw small kindnesses everywhere. A businessman paying for the coffee of the student behind him whose card was declined. A young woman offering her umbrella to an elderly man caught in a sudden downpour. A group of friends laughing together, their joy a pure and simple thing. These were not grand, heroic acts. There were no cameras, no cheering crowds. They were small, quiet moments of grace, threads of empathy woven into the fabric of everyday life. This world, a world without quirks, had its own heroes. They didn't wear capes or have flashy powers. Their heroism was in their compassion. The realization was a revelation. He had pitted this world for its lack of heroes, but he had been wrong. The drive to help, to connect, to protect, it wasn't a product of quirks. It was fundamentally, beautifully human. This new perspective began to rekindle something within him, a pilot light he thought had been extinguished forever. The hero's spirit. One afternoon, during a lull, he was taking a trash bag out to the dumpster in the alley behind the shop. A mother and her young son were walking on the sidewalk across the narrow street. The boy, no older than 5, was chasing a pigeon, his laughter echoing in the alley. The mother called his name, her voice a mix of amusement and warning. Then it happened. A delivery truck, moving a little too fast, rounded the corner. The boy, lost in his chase, tripped and tumbled off the curb, directly into the truck's path. The mother screamed. The driver's eyes went wide. Time seemed to slow down, a familiar sensation for Izuku. He couldn't use super speed. He couldn't leap across the alley. It would be too obvious, too much of a flare of power. His mind, honed by 1,000 battles, calculated the variables in a nanosecond. The truck's speed, the boy's position, the objects in the environment. His eyes locked on a loose, overflowing metal trash can on the opposite curb. He didn't move a muscle. He just focused, releasing a tiny, hyper-concentrated sliver of Fa Jin's kinetic energy. Not from his body, but projecting it a few feet away. It was a flick of impossible force, no bigger than a snap of the fingers. The trash can, which had been perfectly still, wobbled and tipped over. It spilled its contents of plastic bottles and cardboard onto the pavement, directly in the boy's path. The boy, startled by the sudden clatter, fell backward onto the curb, his bottom landing safely on the concrete just as the truck screeched to a halt, its bumper inches from where he had been. It was over in 2 seconds. The mother, sobbing with relief, rushed to her son. The truck driver, pale and shaken, got out, apologizing profusely. To everyone involved, it was a 1-in-a-million miracle. A random, lucky accident. A trash can falling over at the perfect, impossible moment. Only Izuku knew the truth. He stood in the shadows of the alley, his heart hammering in his chest, his hand pressed against the cool brick of the wall. Danger sense, which had been a steady hum, hadn't spiked. His suppression had held. He hadn't sent up a flare. A ghost of a feeling returned to him, something he hadn't felt since his world had ended. The quiet, profound satisfaction of a successful rescue. The warmth of knowing someone was safe because he was there. It was a flicker of the old fire, and it felt like coming home. He performed other, similar acts of mundane heroism in the following weeks. A tiny, almost invisible tendril of black whip, thinner than a spider's thread, nudged a falling wrench on a construction site just enough for it to miss a worker below. A subtle application of float's localized gravity alteration slowed a speeding bicycle just enough to prevent a collision with a pedestrian. Each act was a risk. Each time, he felt the sickening fear that he would be discovered, that he would flare his power and bring the unraveling down upon them all. But the quiet warmth of helping, of living up to the promise he had made to All Might, was a drug he couldn't resist. He was a hero. It was his nature, and he was learning to be a hero in a world that didn't know it needed one. His connection to the world deepened through his tentative friendship with Akari. Her cynical exterior slowly eroded as she got used to his quiet, earnest presence. She would still tease him mercilessly, "Mophead, did you fall in the espresso machine again?" But there was an undercurrent of affection to it. She started talking to him during the slow hours. He learned she was a music student, her passion being her bass guitar. She dreamed of playing in a band, but she was pragmatic, working at the coffee shop to pay her rent. He saw so much of Jiro in her, the sharp tongue, the passion for music, the hidden well of kindness. He, in turn, remained a mystery. He told her his name was Izuku, but offered no last name. He said he was new in town, that he had no family. He was a terrible liar, his evasiveness painfully obvious. One evening, as they were closing up, she cornered him. "All right, Mophead, what's your deal?" she asked, her arms crossed, leaning against the counter he was wiping down. "What do you mean?" he asked, not meeting her eyes. "I mean, what's your deal?" she repeated, her voice softer than usual. You look like you've seen a ghost. Or maybe you are one. You work like you're constantly running from something, and you look at the world like you're seeing it for the first time. So spill? Witness protection? Run away from a weird cult? Izuku froze, his rag hovering over a coffee stain. He couldn't tell her the truth. The truth was madness, but looking into her expectant, genuinely curious eyes, he couldn't bring himself to give another clumsy lie. Something bad happened, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I lost everyone. The admission hung in the air between them. It was the most honest thing he had said since arriving in this world. Akari's sarcastic armor vanished completely. She didn't press him for details. She just saw the profound, bottomless grief that swam in his eyes. Her expression softened into one of pure empathy. I'm sorry, she said quietly. She reached out and, for a moment, rested her hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, real. Look, you don't have to talk about it. But you're not alone here, okay, mophead? The simple act of kindness, the genuine connection, broke something in him. A tear he didn't know he was holding back traced a path down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. Thanks, Akari, he whispered. In that moment, this new reality, which had felt like a prison, a punishment, began to feel real. Precious. Akari wasn't a ghost of Jiro. She was herself. Taka-san wasn't a placeholder. He was a kind man who had given him a chance. The people he had secretly saved weren't abstract concepts. They were living, breathing individuals with their own stories. This world wasn't just a place he was hiding. It was becoming a place he wanted to protect. For its own sake. That was when the world decided to test his newfound resolve. They finished closing in comfortable silence. He took the last bag of trash out to the alley. The building next door was old, undergoing a long and shoddy renovation. He'd seen the careless workers, heard Taka-san complaining about them. As he tossed the bag into the dumpster, he smelled it. A faint, cloying, sweet scent. Gas. Danger sense, which had been a constant hum of anxiety, suddenly spiked. Not the cosmic dread of the unraveling, but a sharp, localized, immediate threat. A physical danger. His head whipped around. Akari! He yelled, his voice tight with alarm. Get out of the shop. Now! She was just locking the front door, her back to the neighboring building. She turned, a confused look on her face. Mophead, what are you yelling about? He didn't have time to explain. He saw it. A blue spark from a faulty electrical junction box on the outside of the neighboring wall, right where the gas was thickest. The world erupted. The explosion was a deafening, violent roar. It tore the brick wall of the neighboring building to shreds. The front window of the Daily Grind shattered, a shower of glass exploding outward. The force of the blast threw Izuku back against the dumpster, the wind knocked out of him. He scrambled up, his ears ringing, his vision swimming. The front of the building next door was a raging inferno. Debris rained down. His heart seized in his chest. Akari. He saw her. She had been thrown to the ground by the initial shockwave. She was scrambling to her feet, dazed and disoriented, directly in the path of the collapsing storefront. A massive section of the brick facade, including a huge, jagged sheet of plate glass from a second-story window, was peeling away, falling right towards her. She had maybe 2 seconds to live. There was no time for subtlety. No time for a gentle nudge or a hidden thread. No time for a one-in-a-million coincidence. The walls he had so painstakingly built around his power, the suppression he had maintained with agonizing effort for weeks, shattered. The arc roared to life. He didn't think. He acted. All Might's voice echoed in his memory. The moment you see someone in trouble, you've already moved. He released a controlled burst of one for all into his legs. It wasn't 100%, not even 20%. But in this world, under these laws of physics, it was everything. To Akari, the world was a nightmare of noise and fire. She looked up and saw death falling from the sky. She froze, her mind unable to process the horror. She saw a blur of green and gray. She felt a powerful, vice-like grip on her arm, a force that was impossibly strong. The world became a confusing whirlwind. The ground vanished from beneath her feet. She was flying, weightless, for a fraction of a second. She felt a bone-jarring impact as she and something, or someone, hit the pavement a good 20 feet away, rolling to a stop behind the relative safety of a parked car. The sound of the collapse, a deafening crash of brick, mortar, and shattering glass, happened where she had been standing a moment before. She lay on the pavement, gasping for air, her body screaming from the rough landing. Her ears were ringing. Her mind was a complete blank. Then, she realized she wasn't alone. An arm was wrapped protectively around her, shielding her head. She looked up. It was Izuku. He was kneeling over her, his body a shield. His faded gray hoodie was smoking, peppered with small cuts from flying debris. His face was pale, his freckles standing out in sharp relief. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They were blazing. A brilliant, impossible, emerald green. They shone with an inner light, a power that was not human, not of this world. In their depths she saw a universe of pain, of loss, and of a terrifying, absolute resolve. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of frantic concern and the residual shock of unleashing his power. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice strained. "Are you hurt?" She couldn't speak. She just stared at him, at his impossible eyes. The blur. The impossible speed. The strength that had lifted her off her feet. It wasn't a miracle of timing. It was him. He had saved her. He had done the impossible. He helped her sit up, his movements gentle. He looked from her, dazed but alive, to the fiery ruin of the storefront, and then back to her face. And in that moment, something inside him shifted, solidifying into a new and unbreakable form. The terror of the unraveling was still there. The grief for his lost world was a wound that would never heal. But holding this person, this friend he had made in a world he was supposed to be just passing through, seeing her alive because he had been there, because he had acted, it changed everything. Running was a betrayal. Hiding was a betrayal. He was Izuku Midoriya. He was Deku. And he had a power that could save people. He made a silent vow, a promise not to the ghosts of his past, but to the fragile, beautiful present. To the friend beside him. To the kind man who had given him a job. To the millions of unsuspecting souls living their quiet, heroic lives. He didn't just survive to mourn his old world. He looked at Akari's terrified but grateful face, and his resolve hardened into diamond. I survived to protect this new one,